Hey, this is Dan, just dropping you a quick line before you start this episode to let you know a couple of things. What you're about to listen to is one of the classic best of episodes of Assorted Goods in its older format. And by older format, I mean the sandbox and completely disorganized style that Assorted Goods was for its first few years of existence. Now, since then, the feed has been cleaned up, and there's 12 of these classic episodes. And you should know, if you're a new listener, that these episodes are not really what the show is now. But they're still good, and they're still worth listening to. But just be warned that if you're looking to get into Assorted Goods as it is now, that you probably want to go to the latest episode in your feed. Start listening from there. Throughout the episode, you might hear certain things get mentioned, like the website or the social media. Now, those have changed. So don't go chasing those websites or links after the episode. Go to these ones instead. The website is now disinformed.ca, CA for, Canadians like me, and that's where you can find all the assorted good stuff that is mentioned in these episodes. You can find the source lists and additional information. They have all moved to there. In terms of emailing, you can email me now with the new email, dan@disinformed.ca, and if you want to follow on social media, Twitter and Instagram, the new handles are @disinformeddan. And hey, look, all three of those are kind of similar with each other, creating some sort of continuity. People tell me that's important. But anyways, whether you're a new listener or a returning listener, I hope you enjoy this classic episode of Assorted Goods. And then I hope you subscribe to the show and come along for the ride with the new episodes as well. And as always, thank you for listening, and enjoy.
The brain, a pulpy mass of cells and fibers, is the center of the network of fibers that make up man's nervous system.
One of the topics that I always seem to be drawn back to is the human brain. So often I'll think of an idea for an episode, start digging into it, and then suddenly I'm writing an episode that's mostly about what's going on between our ears. But for all the brain talk I've gotten into in the past here on Assorted Goods, there's still so much about these complicated, weird-looking, mushy human computers that I don't know, because in reality, there's still a lot that even the experts have yet to learn. But the brain fascinates the hell out of me, and I love having the chance to learn more about it, and hear new ideas of how to think about, how we think. So when I had the chance to talk to someone who knows a ton about the brain, I was of course absolutely thrilled. That's right, this episode I have a guest. Seriously, I do. Here, look.
I'm Nicole Tetreault, a neuroscientist, author, meditation teacher, and I love talking about the brain.
Yep, Dr. Nicole Tetreault dropped by the podcast. She loves talking about the brain, and I love hearing about it, so it's a pretty good fit. We had a fantastic discussion about getting back to normal after COVID, the minds of gifted individuals, and our misconceptions about a group of people who make up about 1/5 of the population. We also talked about anxiety, imposter syndrome, oh boy, meditation, and so much more. This was a long interview, and I'm lucky she hung in there with me despite my rambling, but I really hope you, the listener, enjoy this talk as well. Dr. Tetreault has a new book called Insight into a Bright Mind, a neuroscientist's personal stories of unique thinking. And I really mean this, it's truly a great read, and Dr. Tetreault was an awesome guest to have on the podcast. Now, I don't want the intro to take up too much of your time, so real quick, if you like Assorted Goods, subscribe to the show, tell a friend, leave it a review, etc., etc., and email the podcast at talkbox@assortedgoodspod.com. If you have any questions, comments, feedback, ideas for an episode, you name it, don't be shy. And now, without further pandering for attention, I give you my conversation with Dr. Nicole Tetreault.
In the conscious state, much behavior is based on learning.
This podcast is created in association with Verboten Productions and the No Phony Podcast Network. To learn more and find more great content, visit verbotenproductions.com and nophonynetwork.com.
Welcome to the podcast. Welcome to Assorted Goods. Thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with me and to talk about the brain. That's one of my favorite topics. I find a lot of my episodes sometimes I pick a topic and then next thing I know I'm into something brain related, and that's just where it always ends up. It all comes back to the brain. So again, thanks for taking the time to sit down and talk with me today.
Thanks for having me, and I'm super excited.
First of all, How are things going for you? How are you sort of navigating the current state of affairs, now that things are reopening and the world's sort of, dare I say the word normal? How are you sort of managing at the moment?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I'm in flux with a lot of the different transitions we're in. California had a lot of challenges throughout the pandemic. Now we have a nice surplus of the vaccination. A lot of us are vaccinated here. So getting back to normal quote unquote activities has been enjoyable, to see family, and at the same time, a bit overwhelming, between still doing a lot on Zoom and different things like that. So it's sort of navigating, definitely a new territory. And then when I think about COVID globally, what we're challenged with, I think that we're nowhere near out of the dark. I mean, I think there's a lot of optimism we're looking at, but countries like Brazil and India really are having quite high COVID numbers. And so, I think there's a global responsibility that we need to make sure these other countries get the vaccination and the services they need.
Yeah, it's very strange to remember sort of that few weeks in March last year where almost the whole world all went into we all took the plunge sort of together as it all happened. And then, now that it's the other end of it, some of the world is like, I watch, sports events in the States, and they go, well, we got 16,000 people in the stadium. And I still think, how is that possible? And then, it is very uneven the way we're stepping back out of it into normalcy, so to speak, that, exactly that. There's still nations struggling and probably still have a very long road ahead. And then other parts of the world are like, well, we're concerts and, and restaurants and sports events and everything's back to normal here. I agree with you say that's very, it's difficult to navigate that, and to sort of feel normal when there's still so much that isn't out there like that. It's a definitely a unique situation we've all been through this past year. It's going to be the cause for a lot of documentaries and podcasts, I'm sure, someday.
Yeah, and as it is currently on a lot of podcasts. And the other thing I want to say too is that for people who are able to go to games and concerts and things like that, do it.
Yeah.
You've been sequestered. The performers, the athletes need you. So it's a way of sharing and celebrating. So as well as having awareness that other areas need great support, and I think that to feel good about coming out of, I kind of call it like an unfreeze, right?
Right.
To feel good about it.
Now, I guess I'm just sort of chasing the thread in my head here a little bit. As a neuroscientist, is there something to be said about this sort of reacclimation period? Like, to spend a year, like you said, everything's on Zoom and working from home and locking down and never going anywhere. Is there something to be said about sort of the social readaptation to getting used to being around each other?
Oh, you're totally right. And I don't think you need to have a PhD to know that. I think instinctively you get that. And what I want to say about that in particular is that the social interaction has been so, it's a yin and yang. For some people who are introverts or ambiverts, part of the pandemic actually has been quite restorative in the sense that they have been able to really kind of flourish and do their own thing, as long as they were safe. And then I think there's the other aspect where people, regardless, need social connection.
Right.
So we know one of the key pieces for for longevity is social connection and having at least 3 very strong social bonds. And especially for adults and kids transitioning, when you think about the lack of social engagement, I talk about mirror neurons in the brain and how we perceive one another. And you and I are doing that on Zoom, but it's not the same as if we were in person to
Right.
see the micro expressions to, you know, because also I'm kind of looking at myself. And so there's this like different socialization we've been doing. And also it's in 2D, it's not 3D, you know.
Yeah, it feels like a bit of a new frontier in that sense, right? That there's really never been a point in human history where we only ever interacted with sort of exactly that two-dimensional representations of other human beings, and it gets the wheel spinning to me that do we still have that same sort of mirroring, you know, consistency, and do we socialize the same way? Like, you know, you can see a person, but there's something about in person that really feels more, I guess, natural or correct. I don't know what the word is for it. Is it, you know, is that something that you think is a challenge, you know, again, as we readapt?
Yeah. So one thing that you talked about actually in your sleep podcast that kind of relates to this in the sense is that screens are going to illuminate different types of frequency. They're going to kind of cause a different type of overstimulation. Whereas when you're in real time, in real person, you could see the micro expressions, you could pick up on it. And through Zoom, that is lost.
Right.
The other thing is that recently we've been going out with masks. So we only have people's eyes to make sense of.
Right.
And so if we're not, you know, kind of trained to decode the eyes constantly, that's going to be creating a new muscle. And then the other thing is that really there was this like innate fear of other humans, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
you have the virus, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah.
So it was kind of many layering where people kind of went into this social recluseness.
Right.
And so what we know, like when people are socially isolated, that eventually they feel symptoms of, you know, longing and there is a feeling of lack. And there's also the challenge where they have loneliness,
Yeah.
you know, and so loneliness can feed into other types of symptoms.
Right.
And so it's really important that as soon as you're vaccinated and it's safe, you know, to get out there and rekindle those interactions.
Yeah.
And, you know, you also talked a bit about neuroplasticity in that episode. And that's the amazing thing about the human brain is
Yeah.
that we already have the pathways in our brain designed for mirroring one another.
Right.
So even though that muscle has been not as used this last year, it doesn't take too long for a simple interaction to activate those neurons and that
Right.
mirroring again.
Right.
It would be interesting to consider, even think about the lack thereof, you know, that perhaps like there could even be a higher rate of reward in the brain
Right.
as you mirror someone else because it's been missing.
And you know, you were saying about introverts adapting so well to the situation, and I'm a pretty much textbook introvert. I can spend a few days not interacting with anybody and feel fine. And yet I found with COVID, right before it started was when I started to sort of force myself and do a better job of getting out into the world a little bit. You know, I started going to yoga classes alone. I started doing work for this podcast. I would go around the corner to a little bar and grab a small table and a pint of beer and a notebook and just research and write notes on my own, which was always a big step for me. To do anything alone was very frightening. And then just a few months of doing this, the next thing you know, it's COVID. And a year later, I think, yeah, it's been nice at times to be at home, but I don't know if it's sort of maybe we've all had the chance to reevaluate in this past year, but now all I can think is I really want to get out into the world and be around people.
Yeah, I love that you have that, you know, that intuitive sense within yourself. And I think the thing, you know, that you're hitting upon is we're energetic beings, right? Like we share spaces, we share, you know, as you're getting a cup of coffee, you have a room of people getting coffee with you. So again, there is a communal aspect where even though you're alone, perhaps focusing or say you're getting a pint of beer, you're focusing on your work. there are people in the room where you feel this isn't so lonely. We're all working towards something. And I think when you're sequestered and you're forced into that, it makes you really think about what happens when we have prisoners go into solitary confinement.
Yeah.
What happens when we pull mothers and put them in prison away from their children?
Right.
And it makes you think about the effects that we create in our society, and that perhaps maybe we can have ways to kind of work through reformation and integrating people. One of the biggest challenges that people who've been in prison struggle with is reintegration in society.
Right.
Because they've been isolated and otherized, and they hadn't been trained the skills to communicate in the current state and environment. And so I think I don't know, I think it's been a really huge awakening for people to kind of think about, how can I build more positive relationships and be a part of that?
And I think it'll be interesting, as like you said, there's still a lot more to work through to get back to anything normal, and a lot of countries are still going through this crisis in their own, and fighting through it in their own way, and we need to support them. But also to think a little bit, people maybe in your field in neuroscience or in psychology and stuff, to once we sort of get the, I don't know what the better word is to use, but the autopsy on this past year of what has it actually done to people socially? What, is there an increase in anxiety conditions or social disorders, or, as much as the brain has that neuroplasticity and can change that way, what are there going to be the long-term effects, or like the hangover of this whole experience?
Yeah. You raise a really good point, and preliminary research has shown, that there's been increases in, in China and populations where there's been increased depression and thoughts of suicide, due to the isolation. There's also been increase in, anxiety. Studies at Caltech have found that.
Yeah.
And so the residual, I think, is something really important to consider when we think about trauma, right? Is that, as we're coming out of this, now we're on the other side of trauma's resilience, kind of resetting back after a major event that was challenging or difficult. But regardless, people have been in patterns of fear and anxiety that lead to greater rates of depression and anxiety.
Right.
And so I do think that, what I highlight a lot is it's definitely neuro-individual. There's a lot of neuro-uniqueness that happens, how individuals respond and whether or not they have the inner resources and support. And on top of it, there's also going to be, like you said, perhaps groups and different societies that have a greater effect depending on the ability of resources.
Right. And one thing that as I eventually get to what I was supposed to lead into off the start, but something from your book that has been really poignant, and when you were talking about the masks and all that, and as we readjust, that story that you included in your book about the man in San Francisco who committed suicide, and they found the note, and in his note he said he wouldn't have jumped if anybody along his way had smiled at him. And even I notice now, I if I'm ever, say, walking down a street, I'm not wearing a mask, and I keep my distance around somebody, but even that the simple social cue of to see a person and to just smile at them seems to also maybe be something that might get lost along the way here, that you can't see people's smiles if they are smiling at you. And maybe as we get back into it, to just be generally friendly with strangers seems to maybe be one of the things that's getting a little lost in the sauce as we get back into it. Is that going to lag a little bit as well, that just smiling at a person might take people time to get used to again? I know there's no real answer. I'm just, this is just my scrambled egg brain coming out.
No,
for you.
I love that. And I think it's a beautiful message for your listeners to hear, that you have all the capability to create a smile for someone and
Right.
to be just a space of lightness. And it was interesting you say that, because I walk in a highly dense neighborhood in Los Angeles,
Right.
and we've all been doing walks. And a lot of us kind of would start just doing peace signs to each other, like peace. We're in this, man. And then, it was so funny. I was walking, it was about 2 weeks ago when the mask mandate was kind of released. And the CDC said it was okay. And people were walking. And this one woman smiled at me and I smiled back. And she said, I could finally see your face. And so I think that in small communities, or, in the places you're in, to offer that softness.
Right.
I mean, sometimes we're human and we're going around in our own head about perhaps something that's
Right.
we have a story going on, and also offer yourself compassion when you maybe forget to smile. Like
Right.
it's okay.
Get it next time, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, of course, that's my very loose segue. Such an expert interviewer I am here to get to the point that I was supposed to right away. The reason that I wanted to have you on the show and that we worked this out was because you've written an excellent book. I swear to my listeners, I'm not just being courteous to the author as a guest. The book you've written is called Insight into a Bright Mind. It's a neuroscientist's personal stories of unique thinking. This book, I have to first say, for myself, I don't have kids. My family is almost young person less. I'm probably the youngest person in my family, and I'm turning 30 in about 6 weeks. So, but this book is a beautiful and wonderful look into the minds of young people of all different varieties, and also, even as someone who doesn't have kids and doesn't really interact with a lot of children in his life, I found it incredibly valuable in terms of thinking about my own life and thinking about people that I've known and experiences that I had growing up. For my listeners, this book dives pretty heavily into, I'm going to try to describe it. I may have you put in a little addendum here at the end of it, but you dive pretty heavily into the aspects of what you've mentioned already: neurodiversity, neuro individuality, the aspects of a young mind for people who are, and this is a term that I had actually, to be honest, had never heard before I read your book. I had never heard the term 2E, or twice exceptional, before I read this book. I learned that here. It's a pretty central aspect of what you write about in the book. Can you explain, as though someone just like me who's never heard the term 2E, or twice exceptional, what that is, and sort of some of the indicators, and just generally what should we know about that grouping of people?
Yeah. So, twice exceptional refers to an individual who is gifted and also has a learning difference. So they're known to have exceptionalities. And so a learning difference, can show up is a fact of dysgraphia, where somebody has challenges with writing. They may have challenges with auditory processing, other types of sensory processing as well. And or it can be individuals who are ADHD or on the autism spectrum, where basically, when I did the research, it's about 20% of our population fits into this umbrella. So that's about 1 in 5 kids in the classroom, 1 in 5 adults in the boardroom, 1 in 5 people in the grocery store.
Right.
Where their brain wiring is unique based on their development and their genetics. And so standard school and education may not fit because they are unique learners.
Right. Right. And that's something that I sort of, just to, for anybody who reads it, this book is great for anybody who's a parent or an educator. I found that there was a lot of really eye-opening concepts that you presented it about. Again, 1 in 5. That's not an insignificant number by any means. That's, in my family, that's one of us at least. And it's to think about standardized schooling and all that, and the way everything is sort of, I know especially in America, I'm here in Canada, and we don't have it quite to the extent in America, standardized testing, to put every child and mark them against the same standard, and then just figure that's sort of the determining factor of their value as students. And then of course what that plays into when you go off to secondary education or university or college or whatever the case is. What are some of the misconceptions that you think that people may have about this group, about 2E, or anybody who falls under this sort of umbrella of neurodiverse or neuro individual people?
Well, there are a number of misconceptions. One of the biggest things is when kids are identified in the United States as being gifted, there's a misunderstanding that if you are gifted, you may not have a learning difference. And to get back to it, we use the word learning disabled because that's what gets services. I prefer the word learning difference because I really think it's just a different way of processing information, literally, through your brain. And so a lot of misconceptions happen because these kids aren't going to be your standard kids in the classroom. They can test all over the map. So they could have an A in one area and literally C's and F's in others because perhaps their gift or their learning disability could interfere with that.
Right.
Another misconception is that some of these kids struggle with sensory and emotional regulation based on their brain wiring. And so these kids and even adults, could have emotional dysregulation, sensory dysregulation, where they can get tagged as kind of having bad behaviors where in fact they are struggling at the source. They're in pain. And so I always talk about defining the origin of where the quote unquote bad behavior is.
Right.
A lot of these kids could be misclassified and misidentified as lazy and unmotivated, when that could be due to two different things. The fact that we are individual learners, which is what neuroscience studies are showing, but more in particular, that if a child isn't engaged with material, meaning at their proximal zone of learning, that sweet spot for learning, if they're either trying to learn information that's too challenging for them or too difficult, they're not going to be engaged with it. And so often finding the right level of engagement is critical for these types of kids. They can be disruptive if things are boring for them. They could zone out. And so a lot of these kids kind of get boxed in where they can't really, where they have challenges working in a system because they don't fit standard school practices.
Right. And just again, to sort of reiterate for my listeners, I can only sort of approach the topics of this book and all this stuff from my own individual perspective. And again, like I'm not a parent myself, but for anybody who is a parent or is planning to be a parent or is an educator or works with young people, the ideas in your book are, to me, they make so much sense. I mean, they really, the more I read, the further I got through, the more I thought, like, yes, like this is so, there's so many ideas that you put forward that are all about exactly that every person, there is no standard model of learning. There is no standard for anybody. And if you're somebody who has kids, or if you're, the way I read the book was starting to make myself think about my own life and think about experiences that I had when I was in school growing up. And why did I always, why I remember being in a class and I just could not focus. What was going on with my wiring, and so much that I got out of reading it was exactly that it made me rethink that maybe you weren't a bad student. I always say I was a terrible student. I even when I went to university, I missed a lot of classes, and I was a terrible studier. I was a very bad student. And this book made me almost try to forgive myself a little bit that, maybe you just weren't in the right environment. Maybe you weren't you weren't in the right material. You weren't in the right program. That it's not that you aren't capable. It's that you didn't find at that time the right environment, the right material, the right sort of surroundings to nurture whatever is between my ears. So even if as an adult, to read this book and to think about that, those parts of my life, and even right up to right now, I sit down to do something. I'm like, why can't I just focus? Why can't I just make a whole podcast episode in a day and put it out and be productive?
So one thing that, I'm really interested in is creativity. And one thing that I want to talk to you about in terms of your brain is that what I talk about with these with kids and adults who tend to be twice exceptional or have these exceptionalities, is that when you're in your creative brain, that's a very different network happening than when you're doing executive functioning.
Okay.
And so when you're doing executive functioning, that's kind of start to finish, that regulation, that motivation, that focus. And when you're in a creative process, you're in a different brain network called the default mode network, the brain network that is going on while you're literally dreaming and when you're meditating. And when you're in that brain network, you're kind of making unconscious connections that are happening. And so you're in a process of figuring it out in an authentic, natural way. So you may feel as though you're spaced out. You may feel that you're not doing anything, but your brain is actually working in the background on these sort of things. And when we give ourselves the time and space for that creativity to happen, that all of a sudden things click in, that executive functioning hits right in, like, oh, this is where I wanted to talk about X, Y, and Z. And that flow and that creative synergy happens. And so, a lot of things that I do talk about for kids that tend to be part of this exceptional group is the fact that they are operating kind of on a different brain, on a series of different brain networks.
Right.
And their flow states are very different. And so to give yourself a little bit of comfort, to say, I'm in the process. Dan is in the process. And if it takes me 5 weeks to get it done, it's my process. Granted, we need deadlines, and I understand all of that. But I think there's also to kind of bring in that compassion that when you're in creative flow, it takes time.
And is that something that can be sort of, in the element of neuroplasticity and all that? One of the aspects of talking to you that I was really interested in was because, again, I don't have kids of my own and all that, is to be a bit selfish about it. I'm turning 30 this year, so I have that. I don't know if it's like a biological clock thing of like, well, your life's, this is it now. You're 30, and you are who you are, and nothing's ever going to change a little bit. Is that something that, that people can sort of open their minds to a little bit, that if it takes me 8 weeks to make a podcast episode, can I work on that? Can that be improved? Can I work towards a day where sometime I'll go, you know what? Yeah, that used to be the creative process, but now I've got it. Is there hope for people like me is, I guess, my question.
Well, there's always hope and there's always neuroplasticity and growth. So, it's so funny. When I was starting out my career in neuroscience and I was an undergraduate, I had taken my very first neuroscience course, and it was like, the brain can never change. And it was this idea, like, there's very few areas of neuroplasticity. It's in the hippocampus and it was just this, and the olfactory bulb. Other than that, you're you're stuck as who you are. And what we found out, and what studies have been showing through brain imaging in and plasticity, is that basically the frontal cortex, the area you're talking about that does that executive functioning, that regulation of emotions and motivation and reward, that develops all the way through our mid-30s. And we know that actually we can even grow that part of the brain even more through training with things like meditation. And so we know that meditation rewires the mind, where it activates, genesis in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. I'm going to get very specific, which is a part of the frontal cortex that's very important for mood regulation, motivation, emotional saliency. So understanding what emotions mean, very, very important for our, getting tasks done, staying motivated, kind of being more, more peaceful and having equanimity. And so, no, you have the ability to kind of rewire your mind. The other thing we know about that we've been kind of fed a false story is the idea that you can train your brain or yourself within 20 days. And science is showing that that's actually false. They did a study with college students where they identified where they had to identify and say, I want to change one behavior and make it an automatic behavior. And they had individuals do something all the way from 15 minutes, run 15 minutes a day to drinking a glass of water. And they found that the average was 66 days. And in that study, they found that depending on how challenging the task is, that you could train yourself as quickly as 18 days all the way to 256 days.
Wow. And I think I know people, it's like when New Year's happens and they go, everyone goes, oh, I'm going to go to the gym. And they say, everybody quits by about 2 weeks. And I feel like that's sort of the perception that people have about change and habit formation is exactly that there's a standard sort of, oh, if you want to do this, it's as simple as just, do it for 3 weeks and you'll be changed forever. That again, so much of what you talk about in your book is that there is no standard sort of neural, wiring or processing, or there's nothing about every person's brain that can be boiled down to a simple program like that, maybe it's going to take you longer to form a habit than somebody else might, but that's okay. And that, it's much more forgiving is one of the many things I would praise your book about. It's much more, the approach to everybody's individual brain is much more exactly that. It's not so rigid and it doesn't seem to treat people like exactly that. Well, if you can't do it within this many hours or days, then, it creates that anxiety in people that like, well, the program said I had 3 weeks, I should be completely different. And I'm not. What does that mean? Am I something wrong with me? Did I fail? Did I do all that? It's that I love that study that it can take anybody a very long time to change. But that's okay, that you can forgive yourself and, and use your available resources to get onto that. That's great news that there's hope for people like me, because
there's hope for all of us,
Great,
even including myself. And I mean, I think the other thing too is that, from what I know is that when you do intention, I do a lot of intention setting, is that an intention is something that you kind of focus on, but it's not something that has to happen. It's like, I'm putting this out as an intention. And when you focus on a very specific behavior, like one small thing, if you're saying, you know what, in my podcast, what I want to do is have all the edits done within a week,
right.
And like you focus on because I'm not a podcaster, so I cannot tell you what to do.
Right.
But I'm just saying, if you focus on a very specific behavior, not the whole overall thing has to change, but one little thing, then that takes you to the next step and then the next step. And I think, we focus so much on these ideas that we have to change ourselves. And when we step back and we could say, well, wait, what my really great strengths are is I think of really complicated topics. And when I think of these complicated topics, I really investigate them and like to go down a rabbit hole.
Right.
And that's my process. And sort of like enjoy and say, oh, this is me. I have to read 8 different studies to understand this.
Yeah.
And that's, and I think it's okay, to if you could catch yourself where you are in your process.
Right. And that's something that I think, again, with that looming round number birthday coming up in a few weeks, that the last 6 months or so, I've spent a lot of time and thinking about sort of exactly that idea that, I was a sports kid growing up, and I had no real creative endeavors, even though I come from, my father is a writer, my mother is an artist, my brother and my sister are both very artistic, creative people. And then there was me, who was all sports, no creativity. And of course, in my late 20s, I discovered I wanted to try podcasting, and now I write and I do all sorts of different creative things, but I didn't find those until I was about 27. And so the worry I think I've had a few times in the last year and 6 months or so now is exactly that is it too late? Like, am I limited by the fact that I should have been this creative when I was a kid, and then I could have nurtured it all the way up to now, and all that? And I think it's very reassuring to know that you can pick something up and your brain will sort of work with you, and to be patient and all that. And it's not, you aren't exactly who you are right now forever. You're not stuck that way. You can sort of nurture these new habits and new processes and all that. And I think to hear it from somebody who is very qualified on the subject of the brain, it's really reassuring, I have to say.
Well, also, I want you to kind of transition something in your thinking to recognize that being in sports is actually highly creative.
Right.
You have to use a lot of muscle depending on what the sport, and literally brain muscle and physical muscle, depending on what the sport is. You have to have your teammates. You have to imagine, how's your teammate going to react to, let's say you're playing basketball, me throwing the ball to them. You have to imagine and envision getting that basketball into the hoop, so there's actually a lot of creativity in sports that I think that we always try to make it an either or. And I think that, you have to remember that some individuals are physically and mentally built where they need to move more.
Yeah.
And that's actually healthy for them. And so for you, the most important thing is going from your strengths and your passions. And no matter what, there's going to be a learning curve. It doesn't matter. I love to write. I also like to write poetry. That's very different than science writing. And so it's like it's a different muscle. And so I think it's like to not cut yourself off. That's the biggest thing that I really want that message across in my book, is to not cut yourself off, to recognize the things that are your innate strengths and build from that, and go with where your passions are. Because if you're doing something you're passionate about, you get that reward circuitry, you get that positive neurochemical of dopamine, you get the endorphins, you get that emotional balance and regulation.
Right. Your brain's ready to work with you through things you enjoy, really.
Yeah.
And you know what? I love that this is an accidental perfect segue, because this morning I'm waking up and I'm unhealthily starting my day by scrolling through things on the internet, which I know, not the greatest. I even did an episode about phone addiction, and boy, have I changed. But I found this great story, and it was a little serendipitous, because it's perfect, because this is a story I found about a woman by the name of Gillian Lynn, and she was a famous, I guess, a Broadway dancer and a choreographer. I'm not as cultured, so I hadn't heard of her before, but there's a story, and I'm not sure if you've heard this before, that when she was 7 years old in the 1930s, which is, long before a lot of diagnoses that we may understand better now, she apparently was an awful student and couldn't sit in class and couldn't focus and was constantly getting out of her chair. And I guess her mother took her to her doctor, and the doctor talked with her and did some assessments and asked her questions, and then said to her, I'm going to leave the room and I'm going to speak to your mother for a moment. And as he leaves the room, he turns on the radio and he leaves and goes to speak to the mother. And when they come back into the room, Jillian is dancing up a storm around the doctor's office. And he stops and looks at the mother and apparently went, "Oh, there's your problem right there. She needs to be in a dance school." And they went, "What? Well, what do you mean?" And 80 years later, she's Dame Gillian Lynn now. She's got a whole illustrious career in the world of dance, all because this doctor in the 30s, long before a lot of understandings of the human brain, looked at her as a child and said, "Well, she just needs a different setting." So, to draw back to that sort of that 2E individuals and that neurodiversity like that, one thing I just wanted to make sure I touched on with you is what are some approaches, if this is 1 in 5 of people, then what are some of the approaches that, whether you're dealing with somebody young or an adult, that you can sort of employ to nurture them? What can the 4 out of 5 of us do to help nurture the environment for 2E individuals?
Yeah, that's a beautiful question. And I love the story you shared, because that really hits the nail. My mentor actually wrote I think one of his first essays in his book was about her.
Oh, okay.
Was so it's a great circular. And I think that that exactly is to identify where the strengths are and allow the child to lead you to their strengths and nurture those strengths. Because when you build an individual based on their true abilities and their capabilities, everything else seamlessly happens. Whereas when you're trying, that example is in dance, but that could be, for a kid, who loves to draw, say they have challenges where, writing an essay is challenging, but they're a very good artist. Have them storyboard it first through drawing. So kind of coming from a very creative way where they can show what's going on inside their mind. Because, in education, we have these boxes of how written production and communication needs to happen. And when we kind of open up Pandora's box of the possibilities of written production and communication and individual neurobiology and physiology, when we see the whole individual, we're better to help guide them through their gifts, rather than, we don't want a child where they're always trying to have to blast through a wall. We want to help them find ways to go around and over and find different pathways so there's not so much resistance. So when you're seeing that resistance rise, ask them, what about this is challenging? What would make it easier? What would be a natural way that you would want to do this?
And is it common for whether people are classified as 2E or not? Is it common for people who excel in certain areas or children who excel in certain areas to lag behind in others? I have friends who have kids and they'll say, "Oh, he's reading way above his grade level, but he's struggling in math," or something like that. Is it common, in either group for one area to exceed and another to fall behind like that?
Yeah, the concept of asynchronous brain development and human development really hits on that. And that's kind of a center feature on that is that we don't develop uniformly, that the brain is developing out of sync, and certain areas are going to be overdeveloped, which are going to be in your strengths areas. And we only have a limited amount of ability to grow with our skull, that things are just going to take a little bit longer to develop, depending on puberty. We know there's a massive brain growth happening between ages 9 through 14. And it still continues to grow. And so I think that, when you're thinking about a child, it would only make sense that they are going to have these asynchronies. And so for you as a parent or an educator or an uncle or an aunt, to really help guide them in their strengths areas and then bring in supports where they are having challenges.
Right. And beyond just sort of that pigeonholing of kids to say, you know, well, you're a great reader, but he struggles in math, and we're going to put them into a category or something like that. I believe you touched on in your book that there's also sometimes that social, that sort of I don't know what the word I'm looking for here is, but that social aspect of it, of that you take a kid who's doing great in one area, but then you put them on, say, like an IEP plan, and then they feel sort of a social isolation because now they're othered in that sense, that they're, you know, they may be exceptional in certain areas, but because they're struggling in math, now they need to go to some program. And now it feels weird because, you know, well, none of my friends are in this program and all that. And my best friend, when I was talking about doing this interview with him the other day, he said the same thing. He said, you know, I was a kid who was really ahead in a lot of ways, but then in order to pursue those strengths, the education system would have put him in a place where he would have, you know, been removed from his friends and been removed from a lot of other important aspects of his life at that time. And so he never pursued it. You know, is that something that you feel we don't do a good job as, that even when somebody's being, I guess, appreciated for the parts of their development that are above, say, baseline levels, that we don't do a good job of sort of insulating them from these residual sort of social aspects that may be lost by putting them into a separate program or putting them into a different spot?
Yeah, no, I think you're saying a lot that is at the challenge and at the heart of education that we struggle with currently. Because the first thing is that when you see a child who could excel in an area, the natural thing is to want to excel them.
Yeah.
And the first thing that kind of happens with these kids is they get pigeonholed, where one, they're kind of forced into that gift where they may like math, but they may enjoy drawing more.
Right.
And, you know, they're being told, oh, you need to be a mathematician or an architect or something like that. And, you know, they actually, you know, want to do computer programming and design or something like that. And so we can sometimes pigeonhole a child based on their gift and kind of overpopulate them with activities to build that strength. And we may not ask them, is this what you want to do? The second thing that, pardon me, that I talk about is deficit learning, that sometimes we are so focused on telling the child all the things that need to be fixed about them that we miss their natural strengths, and they're taken for granted. And they kind of grow up feeling that they're never enough. And then you have like the third category that you're addressing, that sometimes these excess programs can cause social isolation because they're in pull-out programs and they're not with their natural classmates. And so then they're missing that social emotional connection that is such an integral part of developing children,
Right.
And adults. And so, I mean, you kind of think about it. I mean, I don't work in an office, but if you're working in an office, you know, and people get pulled out on certain projects, and maybe you enjoy working with Sam and Sam isn't in your group because they're not reading at your level, then, you know, and you're with somebody else, and perhaps you could have had a more synergistic kind of group. And so sometimes, you know, one thing that I love that my provost at Bridges Graduate School does, Dr. Baum, she really focuses on, when she puts groups together, to have people be certain roles in the group based on their strengths to build that group. Right. So even if you have those asynchronies, that they help build one another naturally. And at the same time, also to come out of your comfort zone. So, you know, you don't want to teach a child to have aversion for an area that they're challenged with. You want them to investigate and inquire and not totally shun off from it, because that could be, you know, maladaptive for their development, where they could learn things are hard. I don't ever want to do it. And sometimes in jobs, we have to do things that are hard, that don't come easy to us. We sometimes have to do things that are boring. And so the other piece is giving the child the why. A lot of them need to know the why so they can thrive. And when you give them that, like you have to write your name on your paper because you won't get credit, versus like, this is the order and this is the law. If you give them the reason why, some of them may not care, and they may still say, I'm not writing my name. In that case, you're like, all right, let's get a stamp. You got to think of these workarounds, right? So yeah, I think we do struggle with that quite a bit.
All right, we're going to take a break here. I know we really got into it, and Dr. Tetreault has so much more wisdom to share. We're going to hear some quick messages from some friends in the podcast community. But in the second half of the episode, imposter syndrome, anxiety, our inability to accept praise, and our tendencies to focus on the negative, also meditation and some solutions to start to create better habits. There's a whole lot of good stuff coming up in the second half, so stick around. Assorted Goods will be right back.
Hi, my name is Sean Landry, hopeful executive director of the Ledge Theater. What's the Ledge Theater? Well, the Ledge Theater is a operated and owned African-American hopeful theater in Los Angeles, California. A full theater filled with music and dance and laughter. Our goal with the Ledge is to have some of the best teachers and instructors of color and from everywhere teach at our theater. So if you're interested in making this dream come true for African Americans and people of color and the LGBTQI community to have a space where all of us can perform and play, go to our website at www.theledgetheater.com and hit us up on our Kickstarter.
"24 hours is like 3 weeks."
Wookiees, lasers, Death Star.
So slugs up your butt is bad. Is that what was gleaned from this?
Hi, we're the Culture Quest podcast. We're on a quest to become more cultured people by discussing a movie, a music album, a book, or anything else really each episode. Check us out, culturequestpodcast.com.
Do you read books? Do you live by small bodies of water surrounded by trees and other wildlife? Is that geese shit? If the answer to any of these questions is yes, you have found a home here at the Brook Reading Podcast. Each week, I read a book while nestled in my small New Jersey apartment and gaze out the window at a brook. Then I jump online, talk about it, ask for your opinions, and bitch about something for approximately 5 minutes. If you would like to join this madness, check out the Brook Reading Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, Spotify, or on the Radio Public app. Let's step into some animal feces together.
And now, continuing on with my conversation with Dr. Nicole Tetreault. Now, the one thing that I absolutely have to ask you about, because you talked about it in your book, and because you talked about it on Jeff's podcast For the Trees, which I am wearing a shirt of his as an homage, because he's the reason why we're even doing this interview. But the concept of the imposter.
Cool t-shirt, by the way. Good merch.
Thank you. I know, right? Jeff's got the best merch over there. Great shirt. It is a great shirt, by the way. I love it. It's wonderful. But the idea of the imposter syndrome, which the people, us here in our podcasting world, we all claim to have it, and we all claim to deal with it all the time. And I tend to believe that we're all telling the truth about it. So diving into the imposter syndrome, the first thing I have to ask is it seems like it's too simplistic a term for something that has to be more complicated than just a simple label like that. So can you explain what actually is the imposter syndrome, and how does it work, and what sort of characterizes it?
Yeah, so it was first studied by Pauline Clance and Susan Ames, where they looked at women who were highly I would say that they were highly successful. Okay. Lawyers, doctors, they were, graduate students, teachers, And what they found was many of them felt they didn't deserve the success that they had. They felt that the underlying feeling was feeling unworthy for their successes and feeling that they were a fake or a fraud.
Right.
And they originally thought it was only in females. And then they did the study in males and they found it was as equal in females and in males, and that it was in about 70% of the population.
Wow.
And after writing it, she really wanted to make it the imposter experience rather than syndrome, because it's not something that somebody feels 24/7. It could have a sudden onset, it could, perhaps you feel very confident one day and you do something 1,000 times, and then it's the 1,001th time. I'm not deserving of this. And I feel like a fraud. And so those are like the common sayings that people have for themselves.
Yeah.
And people fall into like 5 different main categories for it. And so when you're in these imposter experiences, you can really talk yourself out of your true abilities. And it kind of causes a low level lack of faith in yourself.
Now you have, I just wanted to share this one quote about it because I had to highlight it. So I'll just read this straight from your book here. The opening of your imposter syndrome portion of the book. You wrote, the voice of the imposter monster feeds a negativity wheel, spinning through thoughts, stories, and messages of uncertainty, telling you that you are a fake, phony, and a fraud, undeserving of your success, undeserving of your accomplishments, undeserving of being the full expression of yourself, and minimizing your essence. And I feel that is a pretty accurate representation of what that sort of feels like, that exactly that aspect. And I know you discussed this with Jeff on his show. I believe it was my question as well, who you may have discussed, but part of that imposter syndrome, at least for what it feels like for me at times, that experience is the inability to be praised and to accept the compliments. Like if somebody listens to an episode of my show and tells me I didn't like it, or leaves a bad review of the show, that will eat at my brain for I don't even know how long sometimes. And if 1,000 people tell me I did great, it's mostly well, yeah, thanks. I don't know. So what is it about the wiring that we have that does that?
Well, there's a lot to unpack. And the first thing I want to say is, I think the imposter experience perhaps may be prevalent in podcasters because they are interviewers. And so they have a series of experts on all the time. And so they're looking at an expert for all the answers, when even sometimes innately they're asking the question leading them there. And say, you don't give yourself enough credit for the synergy of the actual conversation that happens, right? You need both to make it a process. If I were asking my own questions and answering them, I think people would get really bored.
That's like the normal episodes of my show, really. That's what I do.
Yeah, but essays are very different. Right. And I think that it's a different process. And, what you were talking about, that we have so unfortunate, prevalent in our culture. And actually, this is actually an area of interest in research that I am currently investigating now, that I find fascinating, is called the negativity bias. Right. That basically scientists say that we have a negativity bias based on our hardwiring for our survival. And that basically we hold negative experiences and emotions in our memory much more strongly due to keeping us safe and out of danger. Now, so in modern day psychology, why would our thoughts why would our thoughts do that to us? And I think that's really different because, when you have something that's based on your survival, That's a standard, lion out in, let's say out in the desert, right? Whereas now our biggest challenges are the thoughts we have in our mind, where they're these imaginary lions. And I kind of argue that we've been socialized to have a negativity bias from a very young age, that we haven't been taught to say, I'm good at this. I've done that well. Because if we do, we're socialized as we're taught we're a bragger, we're full of ourselves. And I think that we really do children a disservice by not teaching them at a very young age to call in what they're good at and feeling that success. We also know that the work from Rick Hansen, a meditation teacher, that he talks about taking in the good. So an exercise for you to practice is that the next time somebody says, you did a great podcast, I really enjoyed it, you helped me, to take a pause, connect where it feels right in your body. Maybe it's your shoulder, maybe it's your hand, maybe it's your heart, and say, thank you. And kind of relive and reimagine that experience that somebody's telling you, where you can create a neural pattern that's long lasting of positive thoughts and processes.
So it's essentially, I need to, or anybody needs to train yourself to accept that you can't just suddenly be like, oh, I feel great about this. That we actually need to sort of blaze those trails in our own brains to actually learn how to appreciate that. It's sort of a skill to develop. Accepting praise is sort of a trainable concept in ourselves that we can do. Is that what I'm sort of devising from that?
Yeah. That it's a practice.
Right.
Is a practice to recognize the positivity. That thank you.
Right.
Thank you. And really kind of embody it rather than slough it off, because we're so quickly to slough it off. Because some people don't like the attention as well. Attention feels a little overwhelming. And at the same time, when you're with another person, you see their humanity and you see the level of equality within each of you. So, but if you could recognize your specialness, then you can be so much better at recognizing others.
Right.
So it's kind of a positive synergy that you can kind of to develop for yourself.
Excellent. That's excellent news.
And I also think, when those negativity thoughts come in to say, oh, here you are again. Okay. I know what you are. I don't have to thank you. You could go away now, and just invite those thoughts to go away. And when I have kind of persistent negative thoughts, I say, well, what's the opposite? How could I bring in the counter to that? And can I train my brain to think about activating the positive imagination?
Right.
And the reason why that works is that when we imagine something versus when we actually experience it, our brain doesn't know the difference.
Right.
And so if we imagine the positive experience, then we're kind of juicing our brain, right, for that. Yeah. Where vice versa, if we're imagining the negative, then we're going to be, kind of depleting our brain.
Is this sort of a learned thing, really? We've learned maybe much more easily to focus on that negativity, sort of a remnant of the evolution of our sort of threat assessment, but we haven't learned yet to accept praise. Is that, is it a learned behavior that we can fix? I think is to give sort of hope to myself or listeners or anybody.
I think it's a learned behavior that we can't. I think that there are actual threats, right? Like we just got out of a pandemic. Yes. So there were definite things that you don't want to be like, everything's fine and not wearing a mask, right? Yes. And so for sure on those sort of things, the awareness is critical. And I think it's really honing in on where is the awareness of these negative feeling coming from?
Right.
And when you can identify that, oh, this is just a thought that I have in my head. It's not a truth. I am a good podcaster. I made people laugh. And and really, the other thing that we forget to do about training ourselves is I had a great mentor, Sam Christensen, who I talk about a lot in the book. And he taught us anytime someone gives you a compliment, cut it out and put it up and really look at it, and I started doing that, and I started to see that, okay, that there are things that I'm doing that are worthwhile, right. And to recognize that at the same time, too, regardless of getting a compliment or not, how does it feel inside of you? Right. When you're doing your podcast, are you enjoying it? Are you in flow? And that's what matters most, because when you're in that, people want to be a part of it. Right. They see this guy's, he's coming into who he is, and he's sharing who he is. That's helping me identify who I am.
Right. Whether you know it or not, when you create something, you that sort of shines through. It's something that I've tried to learn over the past few years as I've started to do new creative things, is that exactly that being authentic in what you do and doing it because you love to do it is something that shines through, and that people can sense that, they can sense whatever you create. If you're creating it just for whatever, because you want to be famous, or you want to, that shows as much as somebody who's doing it with authenticity and with sort of a real love of what they're doing. It always seems to be evident whether it's obvious or not. It's something people just can tell whether or not you're phoning it in or you're faking it, or whatever the case is. So now I wanted to get to anxiety as well, because the one term that gets used a lot in your book is that anxiety is the fear of fear, which I'd never heard it described like that before, and I never really thought of it quite like that before. And as somebody who is a very anxious person, it really was such a simple way to remind myself as well, exactly that. You also state we have 60,000 thoughts a day, which is I don't even know how that's possible, but it sounds right for me at the very least. So in terms of something like anxiety and that fear of fear, and your hyperactive mind, and the way you can sort of create situations to be worse than they really are, what are some from your perspective, what are some aspects of anxiety that maybe an anxious person needs to think of it as? Is there sort of a different perspective you can offer on just the basic idea of being an anxious person and how our minds are working?
Yeah. So that's a really important question. Well, anxiety is, when you think about people being primed for anxiety, we know that just as different parts of our brains develop, we develop circuitry in relation to processing our emotions. And some people tend to be more in tune with their kind of emotional storytelling and the patterns that they've experienced. And anxiety is really like anything. It's a practice in a lot of ways. When I talk about it's a fear of fear, because what it is, it's really activating the imagination based on the worst case scenario. And it's feeding that over and over and over. And when you practice that over and over and over, your mind doesn't know anywhere else to go. And that goes back to Sam. Sam and I were once sitting, and I said, sometimes when I speak, I get anxious. And he said, well, Nicole, if you didn't get anxious, that meant you didn't care. Right. The fact that you care is why you're a little nervous. I would be worried if you weren't, and I think that we forget that some types of anxiety are actually good for us, if you're, and we also forget too, that there's this kind of alignment between anxiety and excitement, that sometimes we can be excited and we can misidentify that as anxiety.
Right.
And so it goes back to, what are the thoughts you're feeding yourself, and if you're like, if and to recognize that you could be both anxious and anxiety and you could have anxiety and be excited, and you could attach to being excited rather than anxious. And a lot of what I talk about in terms of anxiety is to understand your default patterning. Some people who are anxious, you could fall into 4 different categories. You could fall into fight, flight, freeze, or flop.
Right.
And if you can identify, here I am, I have to keep moving, I'm anxious that way, you could recognize, okay, this is my pattern. What am I actually, what is causing me the anxiety? And if you could identify the trigger, you could maybe step back from the edge. The freeze and flop, those individuals kind of dissociate and don't want to do anything, and they kind of zone out. And for that, you have to get a different type of inertia. But the most important thing is that when people are feeling anxious, they're not feeling safe. And so what is going to bring you back to feeling safe is the first thing. And then identifying what is the actual trigger for the anxiety. And then a series of different techniques like meditation, therapeutic writing, talk therapy, are a number of ways that can help individuals kind of move through that.
Right. That what you just said there about sort of reevaluating the feeling is something that I actually, and I believe I got it from reading your book, but the past couple of weeks I had something like that as well, where there was sort of an anxious situation, and I tried to think of it that way, that if that feeling, that butterflies in your stomach, or the that little jump in your chest, or whatever you're feeling, I always immediately draw it to negative, something negative. This is an anxiety inducing situation, and I'm on the uncomfortable feeling can only be because of a negative emotion, right? Or a negative situation. And then I thought, but that's the same feeling I might feel on a roller coaster, where I might be terrified, but that feeling is the exact same as being thrilled, or being being able to experience something that you never felt before. There is, I like what you said about that there's sort of the two sides of it, that anxiety is also an excitement, that you may be anxious, but that's also a natural feeling of experiencing something new. And that one of the techniques I think I'm trying to learn, and I've learned it from your writing and all that, is exactly that if I'm feeling anxious about something, it's also an opportunity to feel a little bit excited, because that nervous feeling is also the thrill of something new, and that there's a new sort of perspective I feel like to get around that being an anxious person, sometimes you can think anything that feels uncomfortable is anxiety, right? That I just started I go to a new job, and the job is tough and I'm nervous, but is it just because this is a bad situation, or is it just because this is a new experience, and that this is what a new experience feels like? And to I guess sort of identify it as something that it's going to feel the same, but just to look at it as, this isn't a negative thing. This is the feeling of excitement, of anticipation, of something positive, is an aspect of I guess dealing with it that I have tried to come around to a little bit, if that makes sense.
Well, that's good. I'm happy to hear that. And the other thing that I want to say about that too is that anxiety, we fall on old patterns. So sometimes we put anxiety where it doesn't belong,
Right.
because it's just a behavior that we've repeated in a story we repeated. And when you kind of come at it from a new angle, that this is a new moment, I'm in this process, and exactly what you're saying, like a new job is going to be exciting and have some aspects of nervousness to it. And at the same time, you're also coming out of a pandemic and you're learning new socialization.
Right.
And so kind of looking at the waves. And I think that the important thing with an emotion that you're experiencing is to really allow it to be a wave, and to recognize it has a beginning, middle, an end and it's never going to last. And that you could call in joy just as quickly as you can call in anxiety, just as quickly as you could call in gratitude. And I think that's something that when we recognize, and at the same time, I don't want to minimize, some emotions do tell us things about things that need to change.
Right.
If you're in your seat and you're physically uncomfortable and you're in pain and it hurts, that's a signal to your body, your physiology. I need to get up and adjust my chair.
Right.
I need to stretch my back. And so I think the thing is that we've put emotions in categories of good and bad, and they're actually information to help us navigate through the world.
Right. That's, I was just thinking about it here, thinking about sort of that scenario that like, I never liked roller coasters growing up. And then in my mid-20s, I went to a theme park and I got on the biggest one. And it was, I remember the feeling of the anxiety going up and then the anticipation and then the drop and the whole experience. And I came out of it and I thought, I never want to do that again, ever. No, not for me. No, don't want to feel that. And then as the years have gone by, I thought, I bet everyone around me had that same feeling, except for them, it was, this is awesome. And I can only feel something this exhilarating here. And to sort of identify that I feel almost in danger, right? That the heart jump and all that stuff and going that fast makes me feel like I'm in danger and I don't want to be in this scenario. But to identify it as also, but you are safe. We're all safe in this setting. And what you're feeling is actually an exhilaration and not a danger. To identify those thought patterns is something that I think as I'm getting older is an aspect of my life I'm trying to change a little bit. Is that something that we can really do is sort of harness the feelings we already have and recategorize them within ourselves?
Absolutely. You could recategorize, tell yourself a new story. You could change your dialogue, your inner dialogue, I think is really powerful. And I think there's also a piece that we know scientifically of offering yourself compassion, and to also place it and say, well, okay, I just went on a roller coaster and it's pretty normal if my heart is about to explode, because that's not normal, like to experience that. And that's okay. And it's also okay to say that's not for me.
Right.
Just because you're trying to reframe things, it doesn't mean that you have to do everything. Right. You could say little steps, like you're saying, the thing is, will the enjoyment of the yoga class outlast my ideas of not wanting to do yoga in front of other people?
Right.
And the truth of the matter is, no one's looking at you. So if you could recognize and say, yeah, no one really is looking at me. And, if you don't want the teacher to touch you, you say, don't touch me, people could have all various ways of feeling about it. And
go ahead. No, absolutely.
And I think that, the other thing too, that you have to recognize is yoga in itself, a lot of people don't recognize, like there's a lot of vulnerable positions people are put into. Yeah. And so if you're an anxious person, it could actually activate more anxiety, and that's what I talk about with, meditation as well. Right. If you're telling somebody to breathe and like the breath in itself is not an anchor and is not an access point, you could be re-traumatizing somebody. Right. Yeah. So you have to be really conscientious that the type of class you go to feels like it's at your level, that the teacher has a trauma-informed lens, Right. And so I think that absolutely telling yourself new stories, because they are stories that we've told ourselves. And I think there's also that compassion, like, I like to do things alone too, and I'm okay with that. Like it's good to absolutely build a new muscle and try new things. And it's okay too to say, this isn't for me, or this is for me.
Right. And the last area that I wanted to touch on with you is, because you mentioned it a bunch of times, and I think it's very important as well, is meditation. And, it's something that I've tried in my life. It's not something I have been very good at actively keeping up with as the years have gone on. You're a meditation teacher. You're an advocate for using it to help better yourself, which I think is the point of meditation, is to sort of work on yourself from the inside out, is always how it's always felt to me. Is it's sort of going into the workshop deep inside yourself and sort of working from inside out like that. But for people who haven't tried meditation, because I find for a lot of people it's difficult to slow yourself down like that. But sort of what sort of guidance do you have for people if they're thinking about it, or what sort of I guess recommendation of how to get into meditation for people who are maybe hesitant or worry that they just can't do that kind of thing, or they worry they can't shut their brains off? What are some good sort of baby steps to get people maybe even just integrating small pieces of it into their daily lives?
Yeah. Well, one of the smallest exercises, easiest exercises you could do, a couple, is one, is a form of meditation, which is called mindful awareness. And mindfulness comes from insight meditation practices, which centers the mind on focusing of being in mindful presence for what is. And that sounds like a lot. But what it is that basically when you're breathing, you're breathing.
Yeah.
When you're reading, you're reading. When you're speaking, you're speaking, and so on and so forth. When you're smelling the roses, you're smelling the roses. And the easiest thing you could do when that moment of overwhelm or heaviness comes in is to take 3 deep diaphragmatic breaths. We know that the breath re-regulates the nervous system, and specifically 3 very deep belly breaths allows it to activate the parasympathetic nervous system, which is called the rest and digest nervous system. And it allows for relaxation where you get vasodilation, kind of that openness and spaciousness all throughout your body, as well as activating a nerve that regulates your autonomic nervous system called the vagus nerve. And that releases positive neurochemicals like oxytocin and vasopressin.
Right.
And what those are trust molecules. They're found in infant pair bonding. They're found in partner bonding. And those are the molecules that make you feel good and safe and that you're in trust. And so that's a very simple practice of just breathing deeply. Another kind of simple way to get you into meditation, if sitting there doesn't feel in the moment accessible and just shutting your mind off, is to take a mindful walk. So walk outside, step in your neighborhood, step into nature, and be present with your surroundings of walking.
Right.
And you're walking, as taking in trees and taking in the sky. We know that when we naturally connect to nature, that calms our nervous system and again opens up that spaciousness. And then finally, one practice, it's a bit more of an advanced practice, but it's at the cornerstone of heartful awareness, is to develop a compassion practice centered on, may I bring compassion to myself? May I bring compassion to you? May I have compassion for this report that's due tomorrow? Whatever it is where can you find the softening in your daily life, where there doesn't feel so resistant, and to bring that in. And so those are, kind of very simple, kind of distilled down pieces of it. And for individuals who are like, okay, I'll take the attempt to sit down and meditate. When I started to meditate, I came at it, and I'll just tell you a personal story. It was after I finished graduate school and I finished my PhD. And I had my dream job to go to Chicago and work in a postdoc and work in Parkinson's human brain tissue. Concurrently, my mother passed away that year, 3 months after I finished, of Parkinson's disease, the reason why I went into being a scientist.
Right.
And I really hit a very, very deep existential crisis where my whole life was built on the hope of science. And I transitioned and I decided that I really wanted to communicate science to people who needed it the most rather than doing primary research.
Right.
But in that deep kind of reimagining of myself with the loss of my mother, I found meditation.
Yeah.
And in the very big stages, early stages, I didn't sit all the time. I lied down.
Right.
Because that's what my body needed. My body needed rest. And so we have these very rigid ideas of what it is to meditate. And in that beginning, I would lie down and do a meditation, and maybe my mind was gone 80% of the time, but 20% of the time it was there.
Right.
And that's what meditation is about. It's bringing yourself back to the present moment, and to get you out of the thinking mind. And so, it's a process, and I still meditate, and there's some days where I sit and, it's a very conducive sit. Other times, it feels like I didn't meditate at all. And it's a process, and it's a muscle, and there's layers within meditation. You think you have finished something and it comes back up for you to relearn.
Right.
And so, for me, meditation really brought in that safety. And at the same time, Dan, I have my own level of fears and anxiety, and it has helped me substantially soften and reduce the inner voices and the inner fears. And so it's probably one of the best ways that I know how to regulate my nervous system.
Right. Right. And it's the one thing that, you're in control of when you do it. You choose to sort of pursue that part of your life. And I mean, I always found when I go through phases where, I get into it and then I fall out of it and I think, well, I'm okay right now. I don't need to meditate so much and all that, but exactly that. It feels almost like you're opening the workshop up. Anytime I get into it, it's like, okay, if I feel too anxious or there's things going on in my life to get into meditation again, it's like, okay, let me pull the toolbox out because I need to go tinker under the hood here and find out what's going on and see if I can sort of exactly that soften it or be able to identify it. And I am the furthest thing in the world from well-versed in meditation, but if anybody ever asks me about it, I 100% say, give it a try, because when it's worked for me, it's been quite literally life-changing, really. And is there anything that, in terms of meditation for 2E individuals or anybody who's very uniquely neurodiverse like that, is there an aspect of meditation that can factor in for them that's more beneficial for them, or any sort of way that sort of works in?
Yeah, I mean, I think for anybody, because anxiety I talk about as being part of 2E as well, in the sense that it's the way your brain is primed. And often if you're twice exceptional, being outside of the box has you feel that otherness. And one thing that meditation does do is it rewires the mind, where it reduces biases of others. And it also kind of brings in the concept of oneness where people don't feel so alone.
Right.
And so, I think part of being 1 in 5, you sometimes don't feel like you're fully integrated with everybody. So it kind of brings in that positive aspects of being part of something bigger than yourself.
Right. I think everybody, whatever category you may find yourself in, feels something of that regard sooner or later, which, it's an absolutely, it's a great practice. I think everybody should at least try it. So, hey, anybody who's listening, you didn't hear from me. I'm just me. There's the expert advocates for meditation. And, Dr. Tetreault, you know more about the brain than anybody who's come near this podcast before. So, is there anything else are there any other topics, or is there any sort of imparting wisdom you want to share before we wrap up here, or anything on your mind, or something you want to share with the listeners?
No, I mean, I think you don't have to be a brain scientist to know that meditation can be that neurosurgery, that positive surgery for yourself. And it's really accessible to anybody if they're willing. And at the same time, the good news about it is, like, there's nothing about meditation, like, there's no competition. There's nothing, and it gets you out of that. You can't do meditating wrong or bad.
Right.
The only thing is it's good for you.
I can't stress this enough to my listeners. The book is Insight into a Bright Mind, a neuroscientist's personal stories of unique thinking. My guest here this episode, Dr. Nicole Tetreault. Am I saying it right? Can you give it to me if I'm not saying it right?
You're saying it great.
Perfect.
You're Canadian. It's
Perfect.
French Canadian. You got it.
When you get that EAUL thing, you get that in the name here. Us Canadians, we know. We've been in class before. We've seen that before. So again, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today. The book is absolutely fantastic. I really mean that. Do you have anything? Can you tell people where they can find you? Anything you want to plug for the listeners to divert them to somewhere else afterwards?
No, I mean, thank you so much for having me. It's been a true pleasure and honor to get to know you and hear some of your stories and vulnerability. And your listeners are really lucky to have you.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, no, you can find my book wherever books are sold. So have fun.
Please buy it, folks.
Yeah. And take in that compliment, Dan.
Right.
Write it out.
I was going to say, I'm going to take the moment to just do the little feel it and try to take it with me. All right. That's all for this episode of Assorted Goods. I really hope you enjoyed this episode and the conversation we were able to have. Please go out and buy Dr. Tetreault's book, Insight into a Bright Mind. I can't keep sucking up to this book enough. It is a really great read with a lot of ideas that I believe people should think about when it comes to the human brain, especially in young and gifted people. You can find Insight into a Bright Mind wherever you buy your books. I'll even turn a blind eye if you buy it off Amazon. Just this once, though. I want to thank Dr. Tetreault again one more time, and if you enjoyed this episode or you felt like you got something of value out of it, I hope you'll share it with a friend or even subscribe to Assorted Goods yourself. You can also follow Assorted Goods on Twitter @AssortedGoodsPC, or find the podcast on Instagram if that's your thing, @AssortedGoodsPod. And of course, check out the podcast website, assortedgoodspod.com, where you can hit me up through the contact page or check out past episodes, source lists for the writing of the show, and even a few bits of writing I've done myself out there in the world. Hope you'll find it all useful too. Thanks again for listening and taking the time. Hope you have a good one out there. Take a minute to appreciate something good today, and I'll see you next episode here on Assorted Goods.